I'm Jay Hamilton. I'm the Hearst Professor of Communication at Stanford, where I also direct the journalism program. I think computational journalism is a clunky term. It's going to be defined by the set of tools that journalists end up using, and I tend to think of it as stories by, through, and about algorithms. Sometimes if you tell a story, you can tell it by software. So the Associated Press each quarter produces more than 4,000 articles about quarterly earnings reports by software. Stories through algorithms, if you think about discovering a story by using algorithms. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution last year was a Pulitzer finalist through the use of machine learning. They wanted to write about sexual abuse or harassment by doctors across the country, so they scraped websites across the country of medical societies and agencies. They had about 100,000 cases where it looked like a doctor might have been disciplined, and they used a model using keywords to reduce that 100,000 cases to 6,000 cases, which they could then read and confirm were about sexual harassment or abuse. And they wrote a story which really focused debate across the country on how doctors were continuing to practice even though they had engaged in sexual harassment or abuse. So stories by algorithm, letting the software write the story, stories through algorithms, discovering the story by use of data and algorithms, and then stories about algorithms. ProPublica, the nonprofit based in New York, now has a beat on machine bias where the reporters look at things like, how does Facebook decide who to accept advertisements from? ProPublica was able to place an ad on Facebook. Facebook has more than 4 million advertisers, so it's not like there's somebody on the other end of a phone that you talk to if you're going to put an ad on Facebook. It's all done by algorithm. So ProPublica said, we'd like to place an ad for housing services, but don't show it to African Americans or Hispanics. It's not something somebody would actually say if they were talking to a real individual, but that ad was readily accepted by Facebook, and it also violates the Fair Housing Act. So I think going forward, actually writing about algorithms, holding them accountable, is going to be a new beat of investigative reporting. I think preparing will often involve taking some coding so that you know what's possible. I think now if you look at investigative work, more of it is a team process, so you have multiple people on a team. If you're a data journalist, you don't necessarily have to know all aspects of programming, but you need to have had some programming and statistics so that you can see the story, you can know what's possible, and you may bring in somebody else to do more difficult work with you. But some basics, getting exposed to it, knowing the frustration of powering through an initial puzzle, that's really important. I think we're generating more data in our lives all the time. We often generate through transactions records that can help hold somebody accountable. So the Sacramento Bee did a really great Pulitzer finalist story where they actually found a hospital that was dumping patients by taking mental patients, giving them a couple of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and a bus ticket, and sending them out of state. That was the way they were reducing the stress on their hospital. A reporter figured out I could file a FOIA request, because it was a public hospital, for all the bus tickets that they have bought for patients. And he did that, and he was able to trace the pathway of those patients to different states and actually follow up and see what had happened to some of those people, because some of them ended up being arrested or placed in care in those other states. So it was a fascinating story. He'd heard a rumor about it, but the actual document trail, the purchase of the bus tickets, allowed him to tell that story. One of the reasons I wrote my book was to show how when a newspaper invests in an investigative story, it can generate benefits that spill over onto many people in society, even those who aren't the subscribers or readers. An example would be in 2008, the Raleigh News and Observer, a McClatchy paper, was following the story of a graduate student and an undergraduate student in the local area who'd been murdered by two individuals who were out on probation and parole in a system that wasn't functioning well. They dug deep. They spent $200,000, took 6 months to do an investigation, and they found that between 2000 and 2008, in North Carolina, 580 people were murdered by people out on probation and parole. Nobody else had ever calculated that number, and once that number was out there, it caused increased funding in the criminal justice system. And I went back with one of the reporters who told the original story. We estimated in the first year that policy had changed, 8 fewer people were murdered in the area because of that. Nobody rolls out of bed and says, "Thank you, News and Observer, for reducing the probability that I'm going to be murdered today." But it was a clear benefit to society. That benefit spilled over onto many different people, but they don't realize it. And using the tools of economics, I found that for each dollar the News and Observer invested in the story, society got about $250 in net benefits. So that's the heart of investigative reporting. You do original work of substantive interest that somebody's trying to keep secret. And when you tell the story, lives and laws can change, but you may not be fully able to capture those benefits. So the Stanford Journalism Program emphasizes data journalism and storytelling together, like a Reese's cup. Our idea is that you have to reach before you teach. So you can't just have the data alone. You really have to tell a story that involves people's lives. With our Open Policing Project, which was led by Cheryl Phillips, a former Seattle Times reporter who was president of Investigative Reporters and Editors, she and Sharad Goel, an engineering professor at Stanford, they did FOIA requests at all 50 states for state police data. They developed more than 130 million records of police stops. They analyzed that data. They published 2 academic articles, but they also released the data to the world on the Stanford Open Policing website. They trained more than 100 journalists on how to use it. Reveal, the Center for Investigative Reporting, was able to do a story that looked at actual examples of people being pulled over, possibly with discriminatory intent, and the data provide the general pattern, and the actual pullover of an individual driver humanizes it. I think when people hear about investigative reporting, they often wonder, what can I do? So if you're a reader, donate to public radio, subscribe to your newspaper. Think of your subscription as a membership in a community, not just a commercial transaction. And if you're a student and you're interested in having an impact on society or telling a story, think about journalism.